Grand Canyon is a spectacularly beautiful place. It's as if God split the earth open and said, look at this. And yet when we look at it, there are lots of questions that we start asking. Where did all of these layers of rock come from? And what happened to all of the material that once was inside what is the canyon now? Those questions can really trip up a person's faith. One individual who decided to investigate the Grand Canyon and other areas on the earth is Ariel Roth, and we're going to look at his story now.
When you come to the edge of the Grand Canyon, you look over that huge chasm there, and you see that teeny little river down in the bottom. Little changes going on. Probably the river carries a little bit of sediment, but it looks old. One can get the picture, you know, that there is, it took a long time. But that's if you want to limit your thinking to, hey, everything has to be just the way it is now. You know, the Bible spends 2 chapters telling us about creation. It spends 3 chapters telling about a flood, a major flood. And that major flood changes the whole landscape of geological interpretation. How could a little river like you have there cut that canyon? We have lots of peaks and buttes in here that don't fit what you'd expect from a river, more what you'd expect from a major flood, as the Navajos and the Hualpai Indians and the Havasupai Indians believe, and as the Bible tells us. I was born in Switzerland, grew up there for a few years, went to France for 1 year, and then went to Haiti, where I spent most of my young childhood and mid-years of youth there. Through all that, I always was interested in science. I can remember one time my dad was giving a evangelistic series about the Bible, and he mentioned in there about fossil man, and he had various pictures of fossil man up there, and discussed how there were certain problems, evolution with those, and that kind of intrigued me and started my interest in this issue. Things became much more interesting when I went to college and took a course from one of the professors there who was a creationist in the philosophy of science. And then I realized that there's a real issue here between science and the Bible. I went to my college years at Pacific Union College, and there was a professor by the name of H.W. Clark, who is one of the icons of creation. And I took some classes from him, and he certainly stimulated my interest in this issue. Things really came to grips when I went to the University of Michigan, started taking courses there, graduate courses. I felt that, well, these teachers are good teachers. They're great teachers. The classes were excellent, but they kept on telling us about how evolution was true. And I thought, man, there must be an agenda here. Unknown to me, when I went to the University of Michigan, 2 persons who believed in the creation of the Bible had come to the same department I was in at the university, and they had been excused from the department because of their beliefs. I thank God that I got through there. So they had the professor of evolution interview me. He called me and asked me, well, what are your views anyway, and so on. I told him, well, I can follow your reasoning to a certain extent, but then I run into certain problems. And he said, well, what problems are they? You know, I thought, well, when you go down in the fossil record, you look at turtles, and they're turtles, and these turtles have the anatomy of the turtle all the way down, with the pectoral girdle inside the ribs and so on, a very unique type of structure. Problem is that you go below that, you don't see any intermediates to that, you know. And he said, well, yeah, there are problems. Keep in mind, there's one suggested intermediate there, but it doesn't qualify. And then he asked, do you have other problems? I said, well, I don't know why a warm-blooded animal should ever evolve from a cold-blooded animal, because a cold-blooded animal is so much more adapted to its environment than a warm-blooded animal. And after a few minutes, he told me, you're okay. If there is a designer, you'd expect that he would communicate with us. That we just happened by chance, this I cannot accept, and I think most people feel that there's got to be something behind all this. If there's a long, long time here, in contrast to the biblical model of just a few thousand years, there ought to be those factors, those questions, those tests that could tell you, hey, was this deposited rapidly, was this cut rapidly, and so on? Or was this the result of the millions of years that are usually attributed to the Grand Canyon? I discovered that between some of the layers of the Grand Canyon, parts of the geologic column are missing. And in some cases, it's rather major. Toward the bottom of the Grand Canyon, there's no Ordovician or Silurian. These two major periods are missing. There's 100 million years there. And you look at the Grand Canyon, you see how irregular the erosion is. And you look at the contact between them, you see how flat they are. You wonder about why is that so flat if there's all these millions of years? What you see here is very widespread layers. This is not normal, local, slow deposition. It's more what you'd expect from catastrophic activity as you'd have in a major flood. Among these layers here, we have some gaps where parts of the geologic column are missing, and we'd expect a lot of erosion there. Right below the whitish layer that you see across the way there, not the very top one, but the most distinct whitish layer, tan layer there that's near the top, is the Coconino sandstone. Below that Coconino sandstone, we have a gap of about 6 million years, and you'd expect maybe 600 feet of erosion as a minimum. Some would say much more. Inside the reddish layers, you have another gap of about 14 million years, and you'd expect at least 1,400 feet of erosion there as a minimum. And then we go down, you see a sharp cliff, vertical cliff, that's the red wall. And just below that, there's a layer called the Temple Butte Formation. Below that Temple Butte, you have a gap of at least 100 million years. If you know your geolite column, there is no Silurian or Ordovician there. And over 100 million years, you'd expect on an average at least 2 miles of erosion. Yet the layers lie there very flat, one on top of the other, suggesting that that time never occurred.
Down here a little lower in the Grand Canyon, you can really see these flat layers. If you look over here, you can see the massive Coconino sandstone. That's that big cliff right there, and at the bottom of it, you see the red Hermit Shale. The Hermit Shale is supposed to have sat there for several million years before the Coconino sandstone came on top of it. And yet, we don't see evidence of millions of years of erosion there at the interface between these two layers. What we see is a flat line. Maybe that indicates that the millions of years actually weren't there. They never existed. Those two layers came together relatively rapidly. I
found out, well, no, there's some other places where there are gaps here. The 14 million year gap in the middle of the red layers there in the Grand Canyon. The 6 million year gap at the bottom of the lighter coconino near the top, and so on. And yet those layers are there very flat, and it seems to me that those millions of years never occurred. Geologists say when you don't have deposition, you have erosion. So there's probably no place on the Earth where you don't have either deposition or erosion in terms of, millions of years of activity. You'd have this. Erosion tends to be very irregular. And you look at the Grand Canyon, you see how irregular it is as an example of erosion. And yet, these contacts are very flat. Charles Darwin, in his famous book, The Origin of Species, tries to defend the fact that there isn't irregularity at these flat contacts where there are gaps. And he says, this can be explained by the fact that these layers were in the bottom of the ocean.
The many cases on record of a formation conformably covered after an enormous interval of time by another and later formation without the underlying bed having suffered in the interval any wear and tear seem explicable only on the view of the bottom of the sea, not rarely lying for ages in an unaltered condition.
Well, the argument doesn't hold at all for several things. One, the layers in the Grand Canyon are not bottom of the ocean layers. But secondly, at the bottom of the ocean you have sediment deposition. So you don't have a gap. These things are extremely widespread. We're talking about some of them hundreds of thousands of square miles. And when you have kind of a flat pattern for 100,000 square miles, no erosion, and it's supposed to have nothing, no activity, that is no depositional activity for so long, it doesn't fit the long ages model. It looks like things were laid in rapidly, as you'd expect during the Genesis flood. In 100 million years, you would expect about 2 miles of erosion. The Grand Canyon is only about a mile deep. Did that 100 million years ever take place? Now, some evolutionists would suggest, well, yeah, it was piled up and it eroded back down to that. But that doesn't work at all because erosion is not that flat. Those layers, look under there, the contacts are generally flat. There's a little bit of erosion at them. Once in a while you find a little bit. You'd expect that during the flood. No problem as far as the flood model for that. It's rather striking evidence that those things were laid down much faster than the geologic time would suggest, and it suggests the biblical model. Well, that fits very nicely with that particular concept. Now, one of the very puzzling things about the Grand Canyon, that river cuts through a dome. This is not where rivers normally go. The river could have gone south of the Grand Canyon at a lower level. It could have gone north of the Grand Canyon at an even lower level. No, the river cut right through the dome. And this is part of the big puzzle of the Grand Canyon. It seems to me so much easier to cut that Grand Canyon as the receding waters of the Genesis flood. Here we have the flood covering the earth. We have lots of layers laid down by that flood. At the end of the flood, the waters recede and it cuts the Grand Canyon. One of the interesting features of that's explained by this is the fact that you look at the Grand Canyon, it's about 1,000 cubic miles of material that's been cut out there. That's nothing compared to the real erosion problem you have around there. From the layers above the Grand Canyon, you've got 15 to 30 times as many. We're talking about 15,000, 30,000 cubic miles of material above that has to be washed out also. That's seldom considered in the models. It's called the Great Denudation. Geologists recognize this. They think it took a long time. How are you going to wash all that out? It's so much easier to wash it out with the receding waters of the flood. And when you look at the side canyons of the Grand Canyon, there are hundreds of these. They cut to the edges of the Grand Canyon, but there are no streams In many of these, most of them, there are no streams to cut down these side canyons. Some of them are major canyons. But if it's the receding water of the flood, they would cut this out, and we could add to that, hey, you look at that canyon, it's pretty clean. All the side canyons, they're pretty clean. What washed all that out? Why didn't the debris just fill in these side canyons and so on? That seems to fit better with the idea of the flood.
Most of the Earth is actually covered by water. So for a man who wanted to study the Earth and its origins, Dr. Roth didn't stop just with dry land. He also studied the depths of the oceans.
Commonly, it's stated that coral reefs disprove the Bible because it takes so long to grow some of these huge coral reefs that we have out in the Pacific. Well, I got interested in how fast do coral grow. It turns out that there are some coral that grow very fast. Some of them grow so fast you could build some of the huge reefs in less than 4,000 years. I received a phone call one day from a colleague of mine. I'd been doing research out in the Pacific. The Scripps Institute of Oceanography ship, Alpha Helix, was there, and we were studying the metabolism of a coral reef there and so on. They knew me quite well there. And I was back here and working in my office, very busy, and I got a phone call, and one of the leaders of the Hydro Lab program, which was a laboratory underwater in the Bahamas, called me and said, "Don't you want to use the Hydro Lab for a week for your studies?" I told him no, I'm too busy. Well, he must have picked up some hesitation in me, because he called me up a week later, and he said, "Have you changed your mind?" I said, "Okay, I'll try it. I'll try it." So myself and a couple of graduate students, we went and lived in this hydro lab for a week in the Bahamas. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was developing a program to expand man's outlook and man's ability to work in the ocean. And one of their projects was running the Hydro Lab, which is an underwater habitat, only 9 feet in diameter, 18 feet long. It has a door on it, which is on the bottom. You can understand why they put the door on the bottom, because it keeps air in, the air pressure in, and the ocean doesn't flow in. So you get in and out of it by going through this door in the bottom. They had 3 beds in there for us, and it's hard work, I'll tell you, when you live there, because every time you want to go out, you have to put on all this heavy equipment. We studied pigment, picture, temperature, studies living down there with the coral, studying how fast they grow, and studying this question of factors that might affect the rate of coral growth. The 3 of us, we stayed there for a week, had a very enjoyable time, a most wonderful experience in a ways. I can remember once seeing a food chain in operation. There was a 3-inch belemni coming by the window in front. And this belemni just came by, and a snapper came by and just snapped it. Just as the snapper was doing this, there was a grouper that used to live on top of the Hydro Lab. And the grouper, he just grabbed the snapper. And this happened within about 10 seconds. One small fish eating a medium fish, a big fish eating the medium fish. So just one of the experiences we had there in the Hydro Lab. And when this man called me from National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration about using the Hydro Lab, I told him, now we will not work on Saturday. We're Seventh-day Adventists, and we respect the Sabbath very well, and we won't work there. He said, "Yeah, we know you won't work there. It's okay. You stay in the Hydro Lab. We go in on Tuesday. You can rest on Sabbath and go on with your work afterwards, just fine." One of the questions that came up while we were there was, what if Christ's return occurred while we were down there? would we know about it? Another question was, supposing he returned, and would we have to decompress to get out of there? You have to decompress for about 16 hours. Would we have to decompress for 16 hours? Anyway, some of the side questions that come up during these issues. You know, we all have questions. I'm sure everybody wonders, does God exist? Is the Bible true? And I've had these questions all my life. I ask them all the time. The more I have studied nature, the more I've become convinced that the biblical model is the most reasonable model of how things came about. When I look at nature, I see design. I can't explain how life would originate by itself. I can't explain how the forces of physics could be so incredibly accurate. It just doesn't seem possible to me that this could happen by just pure chance. So my science tells me there's a designer. Our knowledge is not that great, but the challenges are not that great either. What if God exists? If you're looking for truth, you don't want to limit your horizon. You want to have as many possibilities, so in case one of them is true, you find it. Which is true? Are we just here for no purpose whatsoever? Or is there meaning to life? And is there goodness? We all aware of these things that you don't find by just studying matter. Our consciousness, our conscience, our love, our religion, our thinking, our reason, our creativity. This is not stuff you find in the simple materialistic approach of science. There's something beyond that.
The great thing about being a scientist is that you get to deal with mysteries on a daily basis. You want to know what's going on, and the effort that it takes to figure out anything is really impressive. I'm amazed by the effort that Dr. Roth has put into figuring things out, but that's what scientists do. I'm also impressed by the fact that Dr. Roth allowed his science to be informed by his biblical worldview. That worldview allowed him to see things that perhaps wouldn't have been observed by others. It allowed him to ask different questions, and as a consequence of that, we can have a more informed understanding of our Earth and its origins.